Tim. Thanks, everybody. My goal really is to get Paul Ferraro a break. He did such a great job yesterday introducing everybody. You're welcome, Paul. Hey, it's my pleasure today to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Dr. Jim Bellingham, Director for the Center of Marine Robotics, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, or WHOI. A few excerpts from his bio, which I think most of you guys already have. Jim is the founding director for the Center for Marine Robotics, joining WHOI from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, or MBARI, where he was first Director of Engineering and then Chief Technologist. Prior to MBARI, Jim founded the Autonomous Underwater Vehicles Laboratory at MIT and co-founded Bluefin Robotics. Dr. Bellingham's research activities revolve around creation of autonomous marine robots and their use at sea. He pioneered the development of small, high-performance AUVs, resulting in a class of systems which are now widely used within the military, industry, and scientific communities. Dr. Bellingham has spent considerable time at sea, leading over 20 AUV expeditions. He has served on numerous advisory committees and boards and holds a BS, MS, and PhD from MIT. Personally, I have participated in a number of CMR's outreach events, which are unique forums bringing together thought leaders across industry, academia, and government. There's no better collaborator, and Jim's personal dedication and leadership is recognized across Southern New England. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jim Bellingham.
You'll bear with us for a moment. The slide presentation decided it didn't want to start.
Well, Jim, if nothing else, at least your intro slide's going to work. You're good. Who knows from there, right? Ladies and gentlemen, again, Dr. Jim Bellingham, please.
So when I first started dating my wife, every time I would go visit my future father-in-law, he would say, "Oh, great! You know, my daughter's dating a graduate student at MIT. Finally, someone who can get my VCR working." And so apparently that skill set is still needed. So thank you very much for having me here today. It's an honor to be with you and to be asked to talk to you. I thought what I would do is give you a presentation that sort of has four parts. One part really revolves around, I think, sort of framing the questions of what we mean by exploring the ocean. What are the changes that we have coming? Second part of it really revolves around the technology that's driving it and the changes we can see coming in the future. The third part really revolves around the industries we enable, and then finally I'll end with a look at the distant future and kind of come back to that question of what is an ocean. So I think this question of what is an ocean is something which is deeply intertwined with our relationship with the sea, both in an economic sense and, I think for most of the folks in this audience, being, I think, primarily New Englanders, a lot of you sail and spend a lot of time out there on the water. And when we look at the ocean, we think of course, something which is made of salt water. It interacts with the atmosphere in dramatic ways. You have winds, currents. You have sea life inside of it. It's a vibrant environment. But of course, the aspects of the ocean that we're familiar with are mostly the surface aspects of the ocean. It covers, of course, most of our planet, but for much of our history, we've been kind of skimming across the ocean from one spot of land to another, occasionally stopping to extract fish from it or something like that. But our actual knowledge of the ocean is really been minimal. It wasn't until very recently that we began to fill in parts of the map. And as a matter of fact, I remember when Bluefin was doing some of the first deployments for the search for that Malaysian airliner that was lost in the Indian Ocean. One of the big surprises was the water depths in the deployment area were about 1 kilometer deeper than the map said they should be. And of course, we now know that those are very rough seafloor terrain there, very exciting in a way from a scientific perspective. And that kind of highlights our just fundamental lack of knowledge of this ocean environment. Now, of course, if you look at the water that makes up the ocean, it's even more complex. If you take the basic Navier-Stokes equations of motion for a fluid and you attempt to do some sort of scaling calculations, what you find is that for the atmosphere, that the storm cell sizes at our latitudes is, in the order of 1,000 kilometers or so. And that storm cell size determines sort of your observation scale. So if your observation scale is bigger than that, then you miss these storms, and your prediction is basically going to be pretty useless. On the other hand, it also determines your prediction time frame. So the overturning time of those storm cells also sort of defines, kind of in one sense, the point at which your predictions start approaching that chaotic stage where the initial conditions can drive you to very different places, and for the atmosphere that's sort of on the order of a week or so, again at our latitudes. If you go into the ocean, it's very different. At the ocean, that denser medium, different viscosity ends up having these eddy scales or these vortex scales, which are more like about 40 kilometers across. And so what that means is that if you want to predict the ocean, you have to observe it at much higher spatial scales than the atmosphere. If you're going to run models the way we run models for the atmosphere. On the other hand, you do have a longer overturning time for these, so maybe on the order of many weeks or even a month. But of course, since the ocean is driven by the atmosphere, particularly the upper ocean, that kind of limits your prediction scale there as well. It's hard to predict the ocean any further ahead than you can predict the atmosphere. But we need to predict the ocean. We need to predict the ocean for multiple reasons. I think for those of us here, if you think back on that slide that we just passed, all of that thermal structure, all of that current structure, all that salinity structure is in effect the terrain of undersea warfare. Provides the shadows that a submarine can hide behind, and understanding that terrain is the key to undersea warfare. It's what lets you get the first shot because you see the other person or you see your adversary before your adversary sees you. And so understanding that ocean environment has been something which we've understood has been an essential part of our enterprise, and particularly at Woods Hole, an essential part of our enterprise since almost the first days. I mean, the bathythermograph was one of our big contributions in World War II, which allowed sort of the measurement of that thermal structure. That was, by the way, Al Vine, who he didn't invent it, but he made it work in a practical sense. He was also, of course, inventor of Alvin. Worked extensively with the Navy. By the way, I read a really sort of sidebar note. I read a really interesting sort of oral history from an admiral who described all of the marvelous contributions that Al Vine made to developing anti-submarine warfare from submarines in that transition period after the war. When he described Woods Hole, he goes, it's a really interesting place, a bunch of really smart people. Their charter seems to be, as near as I can tell, not to make any money, which I guess was his his description of not-for-profit. And it's true, we are a not-for-profit. On the other hand, we don't like losing money, so there's a fine line there. At any rate, coming back to predicting the ocean, we need to predict the ocean. And we need to predict the ocean because knowing the ocean as it is no longer good enough. We need to be able to predict the ocean, particularly in the coastal environment, which is more dynamic. We need to be able to predict the way the ocean will be because you need to coordinate your increasingly numerous assets in the underwater environment. And quite frankly, I think most of us in this room would agree that to some degree we've gotten a little bit cavalier about that. And let me tell you why I think that we're going to need to get very serious about it. And it really revolves around the use of underwater vehicles. If you're in a nuclear-powered submarine, you have a big array and you have a big advantage over your opponent. Perhaps having, getting those extra few dB of advantage out of the environment might not be as critical. But if you're operating a bunch of little platforms which are energy limited and pulling arrays which are much smaller, there, I think understanding of the undersea environment is critical. And not only that, you have to actually be able to coordinate between these platforms, so they have to have a common operational picture. If platform A over here, out of communication range, by the way, with platform B, isn't in the right place to close the circle, so to speak, you may find yourself in a situation where you actually aren't achieving the coverage that you think you are. So these vehicles actually have to understand the environments that they're operating in. So as a consequence, it's not just predict the ocean for the sake of forecasting into the future, it's predict the ocean in the sense of giving the operator an understanding of the environment far beyond what their senses alone on their platform can actually achieve. There's another reason as well, and that has to do with the fact that we're seeing big climate changes occurring. And those big climate changes are things that we have a very difficult time predicting as well. They actually connect the physical ocean to the chemical ocean, to the biological ocean, to the ice cover, to the large grounded ice sheets, with major impacts on things like sea level rise. And our ability to predict those is essential for policymakers to make good decisions, and for that matter, for industry to make decisions about where they put their infrastructure on the coastline. And so I actually find it's quite fascinating at Woods Hole. We actually are working with a number of companies that are not oceanographic companies at all. They thought that they did absolutely nothing, had absolutely nothing to do with the ocean. And when one of our colleagues asked them to sort of make a list of the things that they did that impacted their bottom line that depended on the ocean, they were astonished to find sort of in the top 20 items, about a third of them depended on some understanding of the ocean environment. So, for example, where they put a plant depended on whether or not the Northeast Passage actually opened up. These are big decisions that they're making, billions of dollars, and they depend on being able to project this out not just days, as we need to, for tactical reason, but in this case, decades. A very different type of prediction with very different demands on models. So I think that part of what makes us tractable is that we're developing new technologies. And of course, I develop underwater robots, so I'm going to show you a lot of pictures of those. But I have to admit that there's a wide range of ocean technologies that impact this. So moorings, of course, have been they've been the backbone of our observing system for many decades. But moorings are expensive. You have to turn a mooring every year, and a well-instrumented mooring might cost you on the order of $2 or $3 million. So large mooring arrays are, for the oceanographic community, prohibitive, except in a very few locations. And as a matter of fact, the largest infrastructure program that has ever been created for the U.S. ocean science community is the Ocean Observing Initiative, and it's put moorings in the southern oceans, up in the Gulf of, off the Gulf of Alaska and in the North Atlantic. And those moorings have been actually deployed and maintained by Woods Hole. But I can tell you that they're an expensive proposition. And in fact, if you're going to be observing the ocean, you want to observe it in a much higher detail. So the other type of platforms that have been developed are drifters. And I think this room is probably very familiar with the Argos system. Literally something on between 3,000 and 4,000 of those systems drifting around the ocean today at sort of 1,000 to 1,500 meters, surfacing every week and a half or so and telemetering their data back. And that kind of gives us the internal pulse, if you will, of the ocean planet. But there's a lot of observations you need which require more power, and because they require more power, they drive you towards mobile platforms. And you start making vehicles which have longer endurance. So the vehicle in the back there is a 21-inch platform that I originally started development back when I was at MIT. That was actually a program we called the Altex program. It was for exploring under ice in the Arctic and for understanding actually the inflow of a piece of the Gulf Stream into the Arctic Ocean. At that point, This was sort of late 90s, early 2000s. We were very aware of the fact that ice cover in the Arctic was declining faster than our models thought they should. And there were a lot of discussions. Is it all bunching up someplace? Is this really happening? Is it part of a cycle? And one of the hypotheses was that a piece of the Atlantic layer was making in there, just melting everything and heating up the Arctic Ocean, which, by the way, appears to be a good part of the story. Now, the thing is that vehicle in the back ran off a pretty expensive semi-fuel cell, which, by the way, exploded in a field test. So, I mean, I think those of you who have dealt with high-energy systems know that they are not to be trusted. Just assume something bad will happen and plan that way, and then if they don't, by the way, that was kind of my early story with acoustic modems as well. I mean, today, I think we all take those for granted, but early on we viewed them as little things that generated blue smoke in our vehicles. So, so the vehicle in the front is kind of the vehicle that I developed now 20 years after 15 years, say, after that vehicle in the front. So the vehicle in the back was supposed to have a 1,500-mile range, but never achieved that, although it was used in the Arctic, and it did map the Atlantic layer. The vehicle in the front is a 12-inch platform, 120 kilograms, and it has a range of 1,800 kilometers. It's its longest run, with sort of off-the-shelf batteries. Of course, in the intervening time, we've gotten a lot smarter about how to design vehicles. Energy consumption of a lot of the subsystems had dropped. That's really the big one. Batteries had improved, that's for sure. And we also really went to great lengths to customize it. We understood how to optimize the performance of the vehicle much better. So I think that's a big jump, right, in a few years. The vehicle in the back right now, if you see those, that eventually was licensed to Bluefin, and actually that's kind of the progenitor of the knife fish, but those are sort of, you can think of them as sort of day endurance vehicles, and that's kind of the state of the art of most of the propeller-driven vehicles that are in the commercial market. But the vehicle in the front is a week-and-a-half endurance vehicle with sort of regular batteries in it, and a 3-week endurance vehicle if you put high energy density batteries in it, and that's done routinely. That vehicle has something like, I think there's going to be 10 of them soon, but they have cumulatively about 12,000 hours, but not commercially available, built in a laboratory environment, building one actually for under ice work now. But that kind of gives you a feeling of how quickly I think things are moving. I think the next generation of systems we're going to do even better. So of course the other thing that's going on is that the surface world has just I hesitate in this audience to use the word exploded. You'll get the wrong, but it is just going crazy, right? For a long time, those of us who are working on underwater vehicles saw the liability issues or liability concerns associated with surface vehicles as being prohibitive. That turned out not to be the case, because it turns out you can make pretty small vehicles that have very long endurances in the surface environment, and they're classified as flotsam. That's not an ideal classification, admittedly, but it at least makes sure that if you have a collision, you're going to be the losing party, not somebody else on a sailboat. And here's a picture of the liquid robotics system, the wave glider, but you can think of a number of other ones. There's the sail drones, which are out there. Autonaut has a wave power driven system, which is out there. There's a whole series of vehicles which actually capitalize on the fact that energy is kind of concentrated at that air-sea interface, right? So you can think of the sun is driving pretty much everything on the planet except the tides. Including stirring up the winds. So the winds are really a derivative of solar energy. And then very conveniently, that dissipation of the winds at the sea surface concentrates energy in the waves. And so if you build systems that extract wave energies, what you find is you go from 300 watts per square meter as best you can do, usually in solar, averaged across about a month, to about 3 kilowatts per square meter, now this way, for wind, to close to 300 kilowatts per linear meter for waves. So the problem is, of course, is that waves are very slow. long and highly variable, but nonetheless, they turn out to be a great source of energy, which have been harnessed for a range of platforms. And so this is an activity which I think has really transformed, at least in the oceanographic community, how we think of working at the surface of the ocean. We used to think of it as a place to be avoided, and now we see it as the place that we put our relay devices, the thing that can talk to the satellite on one side and talk acoustically to our undersea vehicle on the other side, and provide a communication link or a navigation relay. Now, the other thing, and we've kind of known this for a while, is that there are enormous benefits for making small platforms for some classes of application. So it's largely driven by your hotel load on the platform and assumptions about coverage rate. But let me just kind of take you through this curve here. So the curve on the right basically shows as a function of different numbers of vehicles. Blue is 1 vehicle, the orange there is 2, and then the green is 4. How heavy your cumulative survey plat system is, that's all of the vehicles together, versus your survey rate for a normalized survey. And so what do I mean by that normalized survey? Well, the picture on the left there shows, you have an area, you've got to drive your, say, 1 vehicle through the area, so it has to cover a certain amount of distance. And you got to get it done in a certain amount of time to achieve that survey rate. Now, if you go to 2 vehicles, the advantage is each vehicle gets to travel half as fast. And so I didn't put the equations up there. You're going to have to kind of visualize these in your head. You can basically, from vehicle design, AUV design is actually really simple. The most important equation is that you pay as velocity cubed for propulsion. That really kind of, everything else sort of really flows out of that. So every time I double the speed of the vehicle, I have to use 8 times the power to drive that vehicle through the water. Now my hotel load, of course, is everything else. It's all the non-velocity dependent parts of it. So let's just assume for a moment that our hotel load is really low and we're dominated by propulsion. And a lot of times that is the case when you're trying to go fast. Well, what happens is you go from that 1 vehicle to 2 vehicles is your vehicle speed falls in half, and so as a consequence, each vehicle consumes 1/8 the power, okay? So it consumes 1/8 the power. 2 vehicles, so I have to double that, but still, that system down there in the bottom, which uses 2 vehicles, uses a quarter of the energy, because it's going to still use the same amount of time to do the same survey. So this is something we figured out for doing our physical observation programs in the 90s, and it really sort of underlined the importance of developing vehicles like the glider vehicles, these buoyancy-driven vehicles. Now, I've kind of, by making the hotel load 0, I've kind of cheated. So let me kind of remove that cheat, but I've also cheated the other way as well, because when I drop the vehicle energy consumption by a factor of 8, what I didn't do is I didn't allow myself to shrink the vehicle. So if I drop my vehicle by a factor, energy by a factor of 8, well, a lot of these vehicles are dominated by batteries. So in principle, maybe I can shrink my vehicle volume by a factor of 8, because I'm carrying 1/8 the batteries. That means my drag cross-section is a quarter. So now I need a quarter the energy again for propulsion, and I get to shrink the vehicle even more. And so that's why this curve shows that as you go to multiple vehicles, you actually increase the survey rate and actually decrease the overall deployed weight of the systems at the same time. I remember when I ran the first calculation, I didn't believe it. I lost an entire weekend to this. And I finally did a spreadsheet, which kind of did the calculations by piece. I'm a little bit dyslexic, so I've been known to make algebra errors. So I always have to do these things 2 or 3 times before I believe them. But the fact is that there are enormous benefits to going to multiple platforms if your hotel load is low. But by the way, that curve on the right does not assume 0 hotel load. It assumes the hotel load actually stays the same. So there's a big benefit in numbers, and I think one of the things this is going to impact is seafloor mapping. So I think we're having a bit of a discussion about this yesterday of what the optimum configuration is for a system. So you have a certain area you want to survey, you need to survey it at a certain resolution, and for a given sonar design, what is the right size vehicle and the right number of vehicles? And most of us do the calculation for an individual vehicle, but you get very different calculations if you do the calculation for multiple vehicles. And so that's just next one. Now, of course, the other thing is when you get multiple vehicles, you really ideally want them to talk to each other, and right now we're not so good at that, right? If they come up to the surface, they can talk, but then they have to both be on the surface at the same time, so we tend to use some ground station as kind of a relay for them. We do have acoustics underwater, and we all know that acoustics is very environmentally dependent. That curve there in the upper left is for the Arctic. So it's an upward refracting environment. There's clearly regions where the sound doesn't penetrate, other regions where the sound is very intense. And in this case here, your platforms really have to understand that undersea environment in order to use it well, in order to know where to go to communicate. And if they're in the wrong place, the other guy might be trying to communicate with them and they aren't. So there's a whole set of intelligence protocols that you have to add on to the communication stack, if you will, for it to communicate efficiently. The other thing that's surprised me is how good optical comms are. In the deep ocean, Norm Farr at our organization can get sort of about 100 to 150 meters communication ranges at a megabit a second with optical comms. And that's not, a fancy system where, a laser has to point at a detector and, these things all have to line up and, it kind of worked once in an experiment. These are systems which are illuminating sort of a 2 pi steradian volume and then receiving in sort of an equivalent volume. Now you do have an advantage in the deep ocean environment. There's no sun. When you go up near the sun's surface, those numbers change a bit because, for example, you have to use different types of detectors. But nonetheless, this is 100, 150 meter range communication in the undersea environment has big consequences. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. And there are fiber comms as well. Now the other thing I think we recognize is that smarter robots are on the way. This is kind of an old slide, and I kind of break it down, but I use it a lot because it's sort of how I think about intelligence on vehicles. We could probably have a religious war in here over what is the definition of autonomy, and that's a discussion I think we've all been in. I think of it very functionally. I think of it as, can I give the vehicle a fairly high-level set of goals and trust it to accomplish them? So if I think of it just in a functional sense, well, for simple missions, we can kind of do that now. For more complex missions, it's harder. And I think that most of what we focus on is that lower left-hand corner, which is the onboard decision-making and control. So that onboard decision-making and control, I think, is classically what AI thought of as autonomy, but in fact, my experience at sea operating vehicles is that it's the mission configuration part which causes the biggest problems. So you're at sea, you're trying to configure a mission, you're really not feeling that great because it's kind of rough out, and you make a mistake, right? And you have somebody else who comes in and reads it, and they're really good for the first week, but on the second week, they're, or third week of operations of, 18-hour days, they're getting a little tired or something like that. So the mission configuration part is actually, I would argue, the highest leverage part, and it's the part that I think is, even today, sort of seeing the lowest investment. As a matter of fact, I would argue that a lot of our vehicles are capable of doing phenomenally complex missions. We just don't dare use those capabilities because we don't trust that we won't screw something up in our configuration scripts for the vehicles. And then the perception area down there in the right, that's the area where we're really seeing enormous advances, largely driven by other communities, but certainly having enormous impacts in our environment. So this idea that you take a visual, you come in here with your robot and it takes your picture and it has to identify you. Not so long ago, I like to say the 2-year-old human could beat the best computer system. And that's not true anymore. The advent of deep learning and the advances in machine learning has really changed that. So now perception systems can do things like take fairly complex scenes and annotate them. That's a dog next to another dog on the beach. Labeled by a computer. It's pretty amazing accomplishments. Not always perfect, but getting better every year. Now, a lot of those depend, of course, on very rich training sets. But some of the other ones, there's a whole class of this called unsupervised machine learning. Yogi Girdhar is one of our PIs, and he works on that. And that's actually really good at detecting anomalies. We actually use it for fault detection. in our platform. So the vehicle kind of learns what its normal operating characteristics are. When it operates out of those bounds, it raises a flag. And it turns out it's very good at detecting failures that the operator, neither the operator nor the original programmers detected. So I think this is now, of course, it doesn't know how to diagnose it and mitigate it yet. You know, that's kind of left as an exercise for the graduate student. But it is something which is a big step forward, because for most of us, we're building platforms that are really not going to get that much operational time before they're deployed. You know, we're not building an F-35 where we're going to have years of investment in flight tests. We're building systems which are going to go to sea probably 6 months after, you know, the first pool test or something like that. Next slide. Now, so I think this deep learning has had a lot of really high-profile examples. So IBM Watson had its big success at Jeopardy. This is maybe a more interesting example, since Go, and I don't play Go, so this is just what people who play Go tell me is a much tougher game than chess. It's a game of strategy. And it has not until now, until very recently, been a game where a computer could beat a human. And Google actually did this much faster than they thought. They sort of gave themselves something like 6 years, and apparently after 2 years they were able to beat the best human champions. By the way, this did not go unnoticed in China. This was taken as a bit of an affront to the human Go players, and they've actually launched very big initiatives now to be good at to basically win the AI battle for the future. Because this AI, right, as we think about it on our platforms, we see it as sort of out there in the 5-year, 10-year horizon. But meantime, you know, when we're sitting on our computers and interacting with the internet, we're interacting with these systems already. Google's most profitable unit is a unit in Pittsburgh, which is maybe 800 people, and basically what it does is it does machine learning on our interactions, with Google, identifying the right advertisements to target at us. So this stuff is deployed now, it's working now, and it's making companies very big money. And one of the other interesting things is it apparently rewards companies that are already highly digitized. And so I would say that that's something else our community kind of has to learn. I think we're pretty stovepiped. So the ability to pull these data streams together into a framework where you can really take advantage of deep learning. And a lot of times what you want to do is you want disparate data sets for it to look for patterns that weren't recognized by humans. Those are the kinds of data sets you want. So I think, though, that we can all recognize that this process of taking robots to sea and operating them at sea has been an expensive proposition. This is a picture, of course, Alvin getting deployed from Atlantis. And, the human-occupied, occupied vehicles is largely you had to be a nation state to do this. You definitely had to be a large organization with a deep, pocketbook. I think that's all changing quite dramatically. So I kind of have this slide, and I sort of whimsically call it Robots for Everyone. But the truth is that, our kids can probably go and, if they have access to our credit card, order a robot from Amazon, which is a really highly capable robot. And what's more, the software that they're going to put into that robot, they don't have to spend several years developing their own code. They can download code from open source sites. So here's ROS. There's a number of these types of environments. I think folks in here are probably very familiar with Moose as well, which Mike Benjamin has done such a great job of promoting. And MOA, there's a number of these. But the point is that the barrier for participation is plummeting. So the high cost of the platform is gone. The enormous investment in baseline software is gone. And the other thing that's gone is the need to go to grad school or even college at all. Because you can go online and you can take classes from the best schools in the country in autonomy and learn this stuff. And by the way, there are online competitions that you can participate in in order, for example, I don't know if any of you have ever looked at sites like, gosh, years ago I used to follow Kaggle. I haven't looked at them for a while, but they're a data analytics site. And a lot of times, by the way, the winners in that was somebody who was a fireman in Western Australia. Not the people that you would expect, but they were the people who would win some of these data competitions. So I think there's some real lessons. There's some real lessons for us here and some things to worry about. I tell my colleagues at Woods Hole that we've been great. We've developed some marvelous platforms. We've spun some great technology out in companies, but we cannot rest on our laurels. As a matter of fact, we have to figure out how to in effect, ride the wave of this kind of environment. And for us, it looks like a pretty obvious one. It looks like we have to begin to participate more in these open source environments. So that looks to us like something we just have to do. And there's a lot of risks associated with that that we're still discussing, but it appears to be the route to higher productivity, higher code use, faster time to market, and so on. So next slide. Now the other thing I just say is that for those of us in the scientific community, this has been sort of a long time discussion. There's a fellow, Jim Gray, who actually was lost at sea. He went out sailing off the west coast out of San Francisco, day trip, never returned, calm seas. But Jim was a Turing Award winner, and he was hired by Microsoft to do a variety of things. But towards the end of his life, one of the things that he was working on, he was spending all of his time on, was connecting with the scientific community, because he thought the scientific community had the really interesting data problems. He worked a lot with astronomers, and he was beginning to work with oceanographers. And in his view of this, I love this, is he viewed science, and this is an engineer kind of looking in at science. He said, thousands of years ago, science was about describing the world around us. Then we developed a theoretical branch of science, and we began to be able to predict, the orbits of the planets. Those are things that we could solve analytically for. And then in the last few decades, as our computers got better, we developed a computational branch of science. And actually, I can remember when I was going through grad school, my professors, and I was my PhD's in physics, a lot of my professors were like, you did this calculation on a computer. How do I know I can trust it? There's no equations I can check. Right? I mean, I'm seeing a couple of people nod. So this is sort of part of the teething pains. Now, of course, that computational part of science is central to things like weather prediction, climate. All of the really big problems of the day really revolve around computational branch of science. And Jim's argument was that data exploration was becoming a new field of science, that we were instrumenting the world. And this is actually kind of an older talk. This talk is probably 10 years old. So I think he would have been surprised at the proliferation of sensors. But his argument is there's going to be so many sensors that increasingly your science discovery was going to be done in this ocean of data that you're going to be working in. It wasn't going to be a defined experiment or a careful set of observations. It was just going to be this giant pool of data that you were swimming in. And this data was going to be something that you were going to have to, as a scientist, figure out how to work with and how to interact with and make queries with. He called it e-science, and it led to a whole set of very productive interactions for us. So I think this really enables ocean industries. I think this is something which we see as enabling, of course, extraction of minerals from the seafloor, renewables. Winds are roughly twice as high over ocean as over land. We have incredible opportunities in the aquaculture field. I have a whole separate set of discussions. We could talk on that. But I think that this business of our relationship with the ocean changing really revolves around also the fact that increasingly people are going to make money at sea. They're going to make a lot of money at sea. And that's going to change our business as well in many different ways. So take, for example, the seafloor. The seafloor, I think of, I always thought of as a fairly pristine environment. That's really not so true anymore. Increasingly, that seafloor environment is a place which is filled with infrastructure. And if you think about that infrastructure as having comms and communications, well, you can now put optical comms on that and make that part of a communication network for your mobile undersea platforms. So this is a sort of thing where I know OSTP just put out their letter. They talked about dual use. And I think this sort of blending of the environments between defense and industry is going to be increasingly important, partly for protection of nationally important infrastructure. Now, the other thing that's happening is we're seeing an explosion of robotics companies, and you know, success breeds success. So recently, I don't know, Bob Anderson is in here. You know, Ocean Server was acquired by L3. The Open Water Power Fellows were also acquired. And I know from my Bluefin experience, I think there's sort of 7 or 8 what I think of Bluefin alumni companies. So companies that, you know, are spawned by people who are part of Bluefin, and then when Bluefin was acquired by Battelle originally, you know, they eventually went out and started their own companies. And that whole kind of creates this mythology, if you will, which is very powerful and drives these young engineers towards these new enterprises. And so I'm seeing that as creating sort of an environment that feels a lot more like Silicon Valley to me today than it feels like you know, the Cambridge environment that I was familiar with back in the 80s. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about really revolves back on our relationship with the ocean. And so I'm going to take you sort of briefly back to the 1970s when 2 pivotal events occur. And I'm not talking about just Star Wars. All right, 3 pivotal events occurred. So one was a discovery of the hydrothermal vents. So the hydrothermal vents really transformed our understanding of how life can live on our planet. We thought of life as being driven by the sun. You know, photosynthesis, you know, generates that, you know, sort of bottom level, if you will, of the food web, and everything else lives on it. Well, at the hydrothermal vents, we discovered there was a whole new type of life that just lived off of heat and the chemicals, of that undersea environment. And so as a consequence, there was life possible without sun. The other thing that happened was the Voyagers were launched. And if any of you have seen the new PBS special, The Farthest, by the way, it's a spectacular documentary talking about the Voyager program. When the Voyagers went and flew, well, they flew, you know, we're about 90 million miles from the sun. Jupiter is about 480 million miles out. And Jupiter is such a big planet that it has a bunch of moons around it that are almost like its own solar system. And so as it flew through that Jovian system taking pictures, it took pictures of Jupiter for sure, but it also took pictures of those little moons. And one of the shocking discoveries was that Europa had almost no craters on it. It was an icy moon that had ridges and weird structures, but no impact craters, and that meant the surface had to be new. As later flybys occurred, they realized that in fact the magnetic field was distorted around Europa in a way that really could only be explained by a conducting medium, which is interpreted to be a fluid ocean under that icy shell. And the astonishing thing is that ocean is really big. That ocean is bigger than all of the ocean on the Earth. As a matter of fact, if you think of it this way, you know, astronomers used to say, if you're looking for life, what you do is you look in that Goldilocks region, right? You know, sort of outside the orbit of Venus, you know, inside of that you fry, and inside the orbit of Mars, outside that you freeze. And in between there you get liquid oceans. Well, it turns out not to be the case. It turns out that we now know there is more liquid water in the outer solar system by far than in the inner solar system. And it's all driven by tidal energy from the large gas giants that these satellites are operating around. So I think that if you think about going out and exploring that, and we now have missions on the books to go out and explore those oceans on other planets, one of the challenges you have is that it requires a big step in robotics. You know, early robotics was you flew by, or you went into orbit, a little more complicated. Either way, you were working with orbital mechanics, which was predictable over periods of days. When you started landing things, then you had a shorter prediction horizon. Now you're going out to, you know, a place where you're literally, you know, better part of an hour or so communication, round-trip communication time, maybe twice that. And by the way, an iteration time between missions of maybe 2 decades. So now how do you really realistically explore this environment within our lifetimes? And one of the ideas might be, maybe what you do is rather than send the perfect spaceship out to Jupiter orbit, maybe you send a collection of parts in a 3D printer. And when you figure out what you need, you print it up out there in Jupiter orbit. And I think it sounds like a crazy idea, but I think we already see parts of it occurring today, right? When a ship goes to sea, does it have a 3D printer on board? Increasingly, yes. And so I think that we can imagine a day where we're actually building our robots in effect to order. And you know, the thing I always love about working with NASA is they have these ridiculously hard problems which seem unsolvable, which drive us to some really interesting engineering conclusions. So the final thing I'll say is that, you know, these oceans in the outer solar system don't exist just around Jupiter. Enceladus, around Saturn, has an ocean also probably larger than Earth's ocean, even though it's a little tiny moon. And this is Triton in orbit around Neptune. And some of the last pictures that were taken by the Voyager spacecraft before it left the solar system were of this moon, and they realized they were imaging actually a geyser on the surface of Triton. So it's truly a spectacular, crazy world out there, and oceans are much more prevalent and active than we would have thought of. This is a group of people that we pulled together last summer. Sort of half of them are space scientists, half of them are ocean scientists. And it was a big meeting, basically pulling together the leadership of both communities to begin to ask the questions of what are we looking for, what do we expect those oceans might be like, and how would we find life? What would be an indicator of life on those ocean environments? And so finally, I think these types of problems hopefully change how we design robots. So this is just a little plug for our center up at Woods Hole, Center for Marine Robotics, and we actually, of the parts of Woods Hole, we actually are most outward facing towards industry, and one of the recent activities we did is we've started this DunkWorks rapid prototyping environment where we're going to both be providing additive manufacturing capabilities to our organization, but I think more important, we're going to be interacting with a set of the leaders in the additive manufacturing space to ask how we develop an additive manufacturing tailored to operating in the marine environment. So I'm very excited about the future. I think we've come a long way, but I think we have a long way to go. Boy, I look forward to the next one of these meetings and finding out what new robots are hitting the market. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time, and I probably run a little, yeah, good. Yeah, some questions, yeah.
There's so much discussion on climate change, projections of climate change, the numbers are all over the place. So I'd be interested in your view on the future of climate change.
Well, so number one, I am not a climate scientist. Okay, so, but I work with in an organization where probably about a third of our organization work on activities that touch on climate. And so I guess what I would say is for sure big changes are occurring. You know, we definitely know in the Arctic now that the Arctic is moving towards ice-free in the summer much faster than we anticipated. Some of the other things, you know, in a way, so being a non-climate scientist and following the climate science news is a little bit of a case of, yeah, you know, and I follow the primary literature. And by the way to follow climate science is don't use Google, use Google Scholar. Use Google Scholar and search in there, and that'll take you to the primary literature. And the primary literature is a much more vibrant discussion than what you'll encounter in the press. But the kind of general trend is the news on average over the span of decades kind of keeps getting worse. So things that we thought, for example, the big ice sheet breakup, you know, those were discussions which back in you know, late 80s, 90s, you know, people would write papers on it and you'd say, oh, those are like hundreds of years out, maybe 1,000 years out. You know, we don't have to worry about those. Those are just way beyond. Well, you know, what we now realize is that a lot of those ice sheets are lubricated from the bottom by meltwater from the top, and they break up much faster than we expected. But that wasn't something that we realized really until the early 2000s. And so it's kind of those, you know, if you take a big step back and look at it as a span of decades, the news is honestly, it's progressively worse. Now, the climate model side of it, I think is a very demanding, it's a very demanding field. And so as a consequence, nobody trusts any one model. So basically what you have, and I think there's a number of really good summary reports on the modeling, but basically what you do is you do actually what the weather community does, which is you run large ensembles. And those large ensembles hopefully give you something which is, some bounds of probability, a 5% chance it'll be, the warming. Carbon dioxide does appear to be, by virtually all of the models, a big driver. And by the way, that's not really a recent result. You can find, Arrhenius wrote a paper back in the 1800s, actually predicting all of this. He had some aspects of it wrong, but, it's the idea that you have greenhouse gases is kind of not a new one. But I think there's definitely lots of other things going on. We know that El Nino, La Nina drives cycles of changes. There's something called the Decadal Oscillation, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So you have these other oscillations in there that we're still just beginning to figure out, a lot of times because our record from things like satellites is comparatively short. So as a consequence, it takes a while before you get to resolve a couple of cycles and begin to really understand, for example, El Nino, La Nina, we didn't really understand until we put the equatorial array across the Pacific. That was something put in by PMEL, which measured upper ocean heat content. So satellite alone actually didn't give you those measurements. So it's a story which is very much in play right now, and lots of vigorous discussion about any given part of it. But I would say that it looks like something to take seriously. Is kind of my perspective.
I'm curious how the collection of data obviously play on ocean gravity, how that's playing on feeding into the operating efficiencies of squadrons themselves. Are we seeing a benefit of this much more improved knowledge of the ocean and the environment?
I hope so. So I would say that, first of all, a lot of the work that I described was actually funded by ONR. So I think that most of the state of where we're at really, we wouldn't be there if ONR hadn't been funding, some pretty fundamental oceanographic field programs. Actually, the whole Autonomous Ocean Sampling Network, which was a coupled observation modeling thing, was funded by ONR back in the 90s, and that still provides us to some degree a roadmap for how to do this. I think in terms of actionable information, there's a transition. You don't want to get me started on transition issues, but we have a real transition problem, right? And personally, having led a study on BA4, for NRAC, I think a lot of it has to do with that 6.4 funding being tied up on non-transition activities. It's the prototyping and experimentation route. It's supposed to really take stuff that is developed in 6.1 through 6.3 and let you kind of, figure out how to use it, develop your system concepts and understand it, and then define your program of record, for the acquisition program. Increasingly, some poor individuals, we had this discussion last night over dinner, so it's probably a thread in this room. But having that prototyping and experimentation go on is important to so much of what the people in this room work on, right? Because we understand that the systems we're developing a lot of times are game changers and are going to be used by the operator in different ways than perhaps we expect. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. That's a feature, not a bug. And what you need is the opportunity to experiment with that. Now, in the case of MET and ocean data, there's actually a reasonably well-developed method for getting that information out, and that's through NAVO and through the meteorology folks, I guess out of Monterey, if I recall correctly. And so really for the Navy operators, those are largely driven by those operational entities providing capability to the fleet. Now, I do think that having been on a couple of reviews of this sort of thing, that we have pulled back a little bit from pushing the limits of that capability. So currently, for weather forecasting, the U.S. weather forecasting is not the best in the world. The best weather forecasting in the world comes from Europe. If you want to know where one of our storms is going, look at their forecasts. And that's something that, that's something we need to change. I think, again, understanding, and when you come to the ocean environment, I think we are extremely good at that, but that's not really so much an operational capability at this point. I think that's something which is done sort of in an exercise basis. Maybe there's other people in the room here who might comment on that. But I think that's part of our challenge for the future, is figuring out how to operationalize that. And, in the vehicles world, I particularly depend on that. If we don't understand, for example, some of our gliders don't go faster than the currents. So if we don't know the currents, we can't go where we want to go. And we lose vehicles out near the Ocean Observing Initiative all the time because they end up in one of the boundary currents and float off. So I would say that's an area where we need a lot of work. And I think the question of how we transition that capability to operational capability is a big one. I will say in the oceanographic community, we put all of our data out there. There's a trend for us to release all of the data right away online. So if you go to the OOI website, you can get all the OOI data. So it's available, but that's not really what you want. You don't want the raw data. You need more of an analysis product, right? And that's a different thing, and that requires that intermediate entity, which is an expert at working with the data and producing those observational products.
I'd like to piggyback on that question, the use of data to improve or inform operations, and not just data, but the models and the simulation capabilities that you're developing to, as you described, predict the dynamics of the ocean and so forth. How you see that being used either today within Woods Hole or in the broader industry in the coming few years to train a lot of the AI algorithms that are being used. There's a lot out there in terms of simulation-based training environments in the automotive industry, for example. And is that something that, what are your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. And I have to admit, all I have are a set of almost random thoughts. And so first of all, simulation. This is another area where open source software is just, in the case of things like Unity and Unreal Engine, the gaming industry has created these incredible platforms, which are very powerful and I think incredibly productive for us to use. And they tie into a group of students and programmers out there who are conversant in their use, and a vibrant ecosystem of people producing specialized products to operate in those environments. So I think, and I know that different parts of different areas in the defense world make use of those. So I think there's great things going on in that environment, and we can have a lot of discussions about some of the fears on the cyber side that brings with it. I think that for the ocean model part of it, we've always been undersampled. We've always been, so every time we try to oversample, and I could show you, clips of animations of field programs, and the way we think about it is a process experiment. So we say we want to go out to sea and, study a certain thing, internal tides in the South China Sea. And in order to do that, we schedule a big field program, allocate all our assets there, and probably tie the data back to models in real time. And then we'll run that field program as a process experiment and test our models against that particular set of processes. And so and we're told that's how we do things. And to do those are, by the way, a really big deal for us because that's pooling all of your money around one activity. And then what you see is some of the capabilities we developed there then spinning out into the operational Navy. So the gliders, the buoyancy-driven gliders that NAVO operates came out of that old AOSN program in the 90s. So those were created as research platforms for the oceanographic community for running these process experiments, and now they're operational elements of NAVO. So I think there's a route there for getting those out, but I definitely would argue that we're not as far along as I thought we would be back in the 90s, I would say. So, and we're very capable of being much further along. I mean, we have much better computational capability available. We understand the platforms much better. Our sensors, we know how to make cheaper. So I think we can get a lot better in that space in a hurry. But currently, it's the progress it's good. It's moving along. But maybe if you're a submariner in the South China Sea, you might wish it was faster.
Jim, Fantastic, Chad. It's really invigorating. You really sparked a lot of thoughts. I know we're trying to stay on schedule. Just real briefly, give us your vision of where you think ocean energy needs to go, and which of the agencies really got to play besides just DOE and besides just Navy. Thanks.
Wow, Alf, you saved the easy one for last. Well, so I guess I would say I'm a big believer in renewable energy. My old buddy Frank, who I co-founded, Bluefin Robotics with, now runs 1366, which is a solar company, up in the greater Boston area. And so I talk to Frank all the time, and solar, there is just no two ways about it. Solar is crossing that break-even point with coal. And I think when that, as that happens, that just completely changes, your rational economic decisions about, whether you put solar on your roof or, whether or not your community, creates a solar environment, or whether or not your power grid is populated by solar. And of course, it has big implications for transmitting. You still need, for example, gas-fired plants and things like that. Wind also. Wind reach that crossover point much sooner. And I think for a lot of communities, that creates enormous conflict internally. Falmouth, those of you who have been around Falmouth have seen those big wind turbine generators. They've created enormous battles within the community over the placement of those. And in fact, I think they're probably going to get taken down, or at least, turned off. So I think that the ocean environment kind of seems like the logical place to put some of this stuff. People worry about it being unsightly. If you visit other parts of the world, like the North Sea, you can go in places and there's wind farms, kind of lining the horizon, and it doesn't seem so unsightly to me. And it's certainly been better than the alternatives. So I think that, and this kind of plays into a whole question of wise use of the offshore environment, which touches heavily on aquaculture as well. So aquaculture, really kind of is going to hopefully replace wild fisheries for producing a lot of the increasing demand for protein. But in order to really play in that arena, you have to have a permitting environment where you can actually get permits to put it in coastal waters, even offshore coastal waters. And so that's something that I think we have is kind of broken now. And I've been through this permitting process myself on the cabled observatory side in California, and I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. So, and if you're trying to do aquaculture or a wind farm, it's like orders of magnitude worse. So I think these are things which as we start figuring out what our societal priorities are, we need to start addressing, some of those that planning process for use of the ocean part, because after all, we are an ocean nation, right? We basically have more ocean than we have land, and so we have to plan that use carefully. Thanks.
Jim, thank you so much for coming here, spending a little time with us. Clearly a lot of interesting, exciting activities at Woods Hole, a lot of challenges, opportunities undersea around autonomous undersea vehicles. We appreciate your time, your SENEDIA coin. Thank you very much, sir, for your time.